Now let's talk about the dominant role of the middle class, or the middle classes, as sometimes it's called in the Victorian society. How they managed to do it. They were not the most numerous. They were not the richest. How come they became the dominant social force? So much so that some historians say that the 19th century was the century of the middle class. I would say that probably the answer to anything in the Victorian society lies in two words: industrialization and urbanization. So the middle class got enriched by the Industrial Revolution. They got political influence after the reforms that were the reaction to the French Revolution, and they were increasingly city dwellers. In fact, this was another area in which there was a massive increase. If I remember correctly, if you find in the book a different figure, correct me. But I think that I remember reading in Sally Mitchell's book that at the point of Victoria's death, around 80% of her British subjects lived in towns and cities. So, and when the century started, the ratio was more or less the other way around. So 80% of the population lived in the country. And the cities started growing after the Industrial Revolution. They never stopped. And London at this time was the largest, most populous city in the world, and also Britain was becoming the first industrialized economy. What does it have to do with the middle class? The main thing is that the middle class had education. They had access to literacy. Part of their set of values was to improve yourself, to educate yourself, because for them, probably for the first time in history, knowledge was power. And this is how they dominated the rest of the society, through controlling the institutions of social life that required education, that required highly skilled professionals. So the medicine, science in general, this was the area of the middle class. Education, schools, any kind of schools, from the schools catering for the working class. We'll talk about education at a later stage, so you'll see that there are all kinds of schools, and there are schools for every budget, really. So some of the schools were prestigious, fee-paying private schools called public schools, but they were private. Some of them were, let's say, kind of middle-range schools for the middle class themselves. Some of them were schools organized to educate the working class. So the teachers, and especially the curricula and the morals that were taught at these schools were the morals of the middle class. So there is an interesting, and I guess some witty saying about the Victorian middle class, is that this was written by Friedrich Engels, the best friend of Karl Marx. He belonged to the middle class. His father was the owner of a factory, so Frederick could see it up close, really. They were German, but they lived in Britain. So he wrote at one point that in the 19th century, the middle class, or the bourgeoisie as he called them, city dwellers, wanted to impose their values on the rest of the society, so that ideally, in their view, there would be the bourgeois aristocracy and the bourgeois proletariat, or the working class. And this is true. The values of the middle class became so powerful that they tried to impose them on the working class through education, through the Church of England. Of course, no working class people could even dream of becoming the clergy of the Church of England. It was entirely for the middle class, perhaps, and the upper class, the bishops and the archbishops. But the majority of, let's say, vicars, like your ordinary parish clergy, they were middle class, and they would impose their values in sermons and in daily life, just setting an example and being a kind of local arbiter of morality. So education and the church, the science, of course, the science, the university, the medicine, the legal profession, this was all the domain of the middle class, of the skilled professional middle class, sometimes the upper middle class as well. And they would be the most respected people in the society, the most influential people in terms of the inventions and scientific discoveries and the geographical exploration. This is all done by the middle class. So we have science, we have journalism and the media, so the printed media, and there is a vast growth in literacy and reading of all kinds of things, but especially magazines and newspapers, by the middle class, for the middle class, with also trying to influence other social classes. And of course the arts. The arts are almost exclusively the domain of the middle class as well. So all those novelists and painters and other artists. Of course, there are a few aristocrats who dabble in arts, but let's say people like Charles Dickens, he's quintessentially middle class. He goes from very low middle class with a lot of financial problems in his childhood to what you might say comfortably upper middle class, not the highest ranges of the upper middle class, but he is a wealthy man towards the end of his life, able to buy a house and to maintain a large household. So his work is very influential. Mostly his readers come from the middle class, but not only. So eventually what we have is even the aristocracy, including the royal family themselves, being, I would say, forced by the circumstances to try and follow the bourgeois code of values. We'll talk about Victorian values later on, but let me tell you two things. The core of Victorian values, of Victorian middle class values, the work ethos, so very high respect and value attributed to work, any kind of work, and the family ethos, very high respect and value attributed to the family life and sexual morality connected with the family life. And by dominating these areas of life, the middle class managed to impose their worldview, to impose their lifestyle on the entire society. Even those who could afford something more luxurious started thinking in such a way as not to provoke the middle class. So all the luxury and extravagance and this kind of carelessness of earlier epochs was Not a good idea. Not after the long dynastic crisis that was only resolved by the accession of the young 18-year-old Queen Victoria. So that's what we have, and that's why the middle class is so important. And if we talk about Victorian society, and when generally people who are not very interested in history, when they think about Victorian society, they normally think about the middle of the 19th century, the high Victorian period, and the middle class. So these were not only the embodiment of the age, but also the dominant force of the age. And we continue in a moment.